This is the iPhone 7 and this is the iPhone 6s. Now performance-wise, the iPhone 6s with the Apple A9 chip is a truly impressive smartphone. Even though it's only a dual-core chip, in a lot of areas such as single-core performance and RAM management, the iPhone 6s even scored higher than some of the competition with 4GB of RAM and an 8-core processor. So yeah, the performance of the iPhone 6s is really impressive. And now Apple has released the iPhone 7, which comes with a brand new Apple A10 Fusion chip, and according to Apple, it's actually 40% faster than the iPhone 6s. So the question is, how fast really is it? So hey everyone, welcome to the Zen of Tech. I'm Daniel, and welcome to my ultimate speed and performance test between the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 6s. So in this video, I'll be doing a really in-depth comparison, everything from the usual Apple on speed, to RAM management, CPU performance, GPU performance, JavaScript performance, Wi-Fi speed test, fingerprint test, even a 4K video editing test. Everything is covered in this video. So yeah, enjoy. Okay, so number one, let's compare the specs a bit. So in terms of the RAM, both the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 6s come with 2GB of RAM, and in terms of the processors, we have the Apple A9 chip on the iPhone 6s. This is a dual-core 1.85 GHz processor, and on the iPhone 7 we have the brand new Apple A10 Fusion chip. So this is a quad-core processor, however in intensive apps, only the two high-performance cores are being used, and those are clocked at 2.3 GHz each. So on paper, we can definitely see that there's a pretty big difference between the iPhone 6s and the iPhone 7 in terms of the CPU performance. Now, the first performance test that I'll be doing is the classic boot speed test. So on the left, I have the iPhone 7, and on the right, I have the iPhone 6s, and I've plugged both phones into the same power outlet. So let me just turn the power on, and here they go. Seems like the iPhone 6s is the first one to show the Apple logo, and yeah, apparently the iPhone 6s did actually boot a bit faster, so let me just type in my password, and yeah, the iPhone 6s is indeed faster when it comes to boot time. This is quite unexpected. Next up, let's do an app launch speed test. So both iPhones have the exact same data, they're basically clones of one another, and no, they haven't been restored from a backup, so they're all set up as brand new devices. There are no apps running in the background, and by the way, this was the case before the boot test as well. So it's still quite weird that the iPhone 6s won. But yeah, let's start the app launch speed test with Twitter first. And interesting enough, the iPhone 6s actually launches Twitter faster. However, when it comes to quitting Twitter, the iPhone 7 was the fastest one. Now let's try Instagram. About the same, the iPhone 6s was slightly faster than the iPhone 7. Again, when it comes to closing the app, the iPhone 7 is slightly faster. Let's try the settings app. This one was exactly the same for both the iPhones. Again, the 7 is slightly faster at closing the app. Now when it came to the camera app, the results were quite weird. So the iPhone 6s launched it a bit faster, but when it came to taking photos, the iPhone 7 for some reason had quite a bit of lag, and this happened when the live photos was on, but there was still a bit of lag even when I turned live photos off, so this is quite weird. Again, both phones have been set up as new devices, so yeah, it's quite weird that this is happening. Next up, let's try some more stock apps. So the calculator first. This one actually opened first on the iPhone 7, and again, the app closing animation seems to be much faster on the iPhone 7. Next up, the clock app. This one was exactly the same on both, again, except for the closing animation. Now let's go to the more demanding apps such as 3D games. So Temple Run 2 first, and this one definitely launched faster on the iPhone 7. Closing the app, again, the iPhone 7 wins. Now let's try a different one, that Trigger 2. This is a pretty intensive game, and just take a look at this, how the interface is much bigger on the iPhone 7 than it is on the iPhone 6s. It's quite weird. But yeah, when it comes to getting into the game, they're pretty much at the exact same speed. The iPhone 6s slightly faster this time. And again, when it comes to closing, iPhone 7 wins again. Next up, let's try Hitman Go. This is actually one of my favorite mobile games, and they loaded at pretty much the exact same time. The iPhone 6s just a bit faster, but when it came to actually loading the game itself, the game loading speed was pretty much identical. Closing it, the iPhone 7 wins at this one again. Next, in terms of the BBC app, they launched the app at the exact same time, however the iPhone 7 loaded the content slightly faster. Now let's launch, for example, Google Chrome on both. Let's go to The Verge. And the iPhone 7 loaded this slightly faster. Now testing website launch speed test is not necessarily a fair test because the phones are on the same Wi-Fi network, so they're pretty much competing on the Wi-Fi bandwidth. But regardless, I just want to do one more test. So let's launch YouTube, which loaded a tiny bit faster on the iPhone 6s. Now let's look for my channel, Zen of Tech, and let's go to my iPhone 7 unboxing video. And this one also loaded slightly faster on the iPhone 6s. Now let's move on to the RAM test and see how these devices, how well they manage their random access memory. Again, both have 2GB of RAM and they're also running iOS 10.0.1, so in theory the results should be identical. So let's try reloading all these apps that I've opened before. So first off, Twitter, and this one loaded perfectly on both, so no issues here. Now let's try The Verge, and this one also seems to still be in memory. So let's try the next app, Instagram, which again doesn't have to load, so this one is still stored into the memory. And now let's move on to something that consumes a huge amount of RAM, such as that trigger too. And surprisingly, this one again doesn't have to load, so it was still in memory on both the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 6s. That's really impressive. So what about the other games? So let's go to Hitman Go, which was also in memory, so no need to reload this either. Next up, Temple Run 2, perfectly stored, again, no need to reload it, and the game was also perfectly playable on both. So far the results have been pretty impressive, and now let's try the last opened app, the Settings app. And interesting enough, this was the point of failure, so to say. This one actually had to reload on both, so in the end, exactly the same results on both as expected. Now let's move on to the actual CPU and GPU benchmarks. So I've closed all the apps running in the background, and yeah, it's quite interesting to see that we still don't have a close all background apps button, not even in iOS 10. Why, Apple? Why? And now let's start with Geekbench 4. And Geekbench 4, this is the newest version of Geekbench. I think it got released like a month ago, and yeah, now uses even more tests to stress out your CPU. That's why it takes even longer to complete. So now the benchmark is running on both phones. Seems to be doing the exact tests at the exact same time on both phones, so let me just speed up the process a bit because this is gonna take ages. And it seems that the iPhone 7 finished this one first at a 2 minutes and 44 seconds mark, and then the iPhone 6s was quite a few seconds behind at 3 minutes and 3 seconds, so 19 seconds behind. And just take a look at these scores, 3482 single core score on the iPhone 7 and 2512 on the iPhone 6s. So on the iPhone 6s, that single core score is really impressive, but on the iPhone 7, it's insane. But just to give you an idea, this is the 64-bit single-core score from a 13-inch Retina Mega Pro, the latest model. And yeah, this one comes with an Intel i5 2.9 GHz dual-core chip. And yeah, this is a Broadwell chip, so the single-core performance is actually higher than that. Really, really impressive. And even the multi-core scores are really, really close. So overall, really impressive scores here. Now let's try a different CPU benchmark, this time Antutu benchmark, and oh, apparently it crashes on the iPhone 7. Yeah, on the iPhone 6s it seems to work, but on the iPhone 7, whenever I launch it, it seems to just crash. And I actually tried restarting the iPhone multiple times, but no luck with Antutu benchmarks, so until we get the updates, no benchmarks with Antutu benchmarks, unfortunately. So let's move on and test the performance of the GPU. So I want to do a 3D Mark Ice Storm Unlimited test first, and yeah, I know this test is actually an underkill for these phones, so it's going to run the benchmark in 720p, which is slightly lower than a 750p resolution on the iPhones, and the iPhone 7, as you can see, seems to be ahead of the iPhone 6s, especially when it comes to physics tests. So the iPhone 7 did finish first at the end, and got an insane score of almost 38,000. That's the highest I've ever seen in 3D Mark. And yeah, the app needs to be updated because the iPhone 7 is not recognized yet. But yeah, really impressive scores on both the iPhone 6s and the iPhone 7. Now let's try a more demanding test, also from 3D Mark. In this case, the new slingshot test. And okay, this seems to crash on both the iPhone 6s and the iPhone 7. So I'm guessing that this is an issue with iOS 10. So yeah, this app hasn't been updated either to iOS 10. So no slingshot test, unfortunately. Next up, I wanted to do some JavaScript benchmarks. So the first one that I'm going to test is Sunspire JavaScript. This basically tests both the browser performance and the CPU performance. So the iPhone 7 finished in 187 milliseconds and the iPhone 6s, this one finished in 228. So 40 millisecond difference here. The iPhone 7 was definitely much faster. Now let's try running a different JavaScript benchmark. So let's try something like Google Octane. So 3, 2, 1, go. So they seem to be running the test at about the exact same speed, and the iPhone 7 actually finished first, and whoa, just take a look at this, 27,000. That's definitely the highest score I've ever seen on a mobile phone. And the iPhone 6s has also finished now, and got a score of 17,812. So yeah, an almost 10,000 point difference between the 7 and the 6s, that's massive. So when visiting websites or web apps that use a lot of JavaScript, the performance is going to be miles better on the iPhone 7 with the Apple A10 Fusion chip. Next up, let's do a Wi-Fi speed test and see if we have any improvements on the iPhone 7's Wi-Fi antennas. So first off, I'll be doing this test at the exact same time on both phones, just to see how well these phones manage their bandwidth, because in total I have about 100 megabits per second speed, so it should be about 50 on each, and yeah, this seems to be the case. Now let's do the test separately, and on the iPhone 7 we have 93 megabits per second download speed and 89 as the upload speed, and on the iPhone 6s we have 93.73, pretty much the same on the download side, and 86.38. Yeah, so these differences are pretty small, they're negligible, so in the end the Wi-Fi performance is pretty much the same on both. Next up, let's do a fingerprint scanner speed test and see if the Touch ID on the iPhone 7 got any improvements or not. So I've cleaned both Touch ID sensors, and I'm going to use my right thumb on both phones, and I'm also going to film this separately for each device so that we get the most accurate results. So first off, I'm going to test unlocking the devices with the display off, and it seems that the unlocking speed was pretty much the same on both devices. So now let's try the exact same thing, however this time with the display on. And again, the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 6s unlocked at the exact same time, and you can see this even better in slow motion. So yeah, it seems that when it comes to unlocking the phone via Touch ID, we have no improvements at all. And finally, number 15, the last test that I want to do in this video is basically the same test that this video started with, so the boot test. However, this time I'll be turning the devices off, so let's see which one is faster. And I don't know if you can see from the video, but there is no loading bar anymore, and both phones have turned off at the exact same time. So what's my conclusion in all this? Well, in the end, all of the benchmarks that I've done do show that the iPhone 7 is much more powerful than the iPhone 6s. However, in the real life tests that I've done, I couldn't see any major differences between the iPhone 7 and the 6s. I mean, apps launch at pretty much the exact same speed on both phones, and more demanding apps such as iMovie and GarageBand, they did have very similar results, which was really interesting actually. So in the end, you won't be noticing any difference between the two in day-to-day use. But yeah, this was my ultimate speed and comparison test between the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 6s.